Hi everyone, Scott Cable here, and I am really excited to put into the spotlight tonight a forward-thinking researcher, someone who's been quite productive and who is becoming, I think, more and more influential as time goes by, and that is Dr. Alexandra Georgakopoulou. Before I get into her background, her research interests, and her current trajectories, I just want to sort of situate this little presentation with a quote that she borrows from Lobov and sort of explain a little transition that I'm going through in terms of my understanding and relationship to narrative research, and I think something that was an idea or a paradigm, maybe a priority that we will see in Georgakopoulou's own work. And so what she's doing with this quote is, in this pretty early text in 1997, what she's doing is she is introducing narrative, defining it, giving it some parameters that she'll use as she analyzes narrative as performed by a variety of people in the Greek community. So here she says that Lobov basically described narrative as a verbal sequence of clauses that matches the sequence of events which it is inferred actually happen. I'm going to key in on that idea of actually happen for a second. I think what many of us have, I think, started to get our minds around in terms of the narrative turn is the shift away from objectivity toward subjectivity, and part of that shift included a kind of rejection of, when we talk about objectivity, of the idea that we can know an objective reality, that an objective reality exists. And what I mean is that something can exist without our perceiving it. So, if we consider an event in the past, well, something actually happened, but then everybody who saw it, they all have their sort of different ideas of what actually happened. If we say, or if we reject the idea that we can know what actually happened, something interesting happens, because what was a focus on this sort of historical, biographical sense of a person's life, so that the life story, this sense of narrative that gives us some sequence or a sequence of events that contributed to the speaker's nowness. So the identities and the characteristics of a speaker. Okay, we'll look in the past. Okay, that makes sense. So you are who you are because of this and this and this. If we can't really know that those things actually happen, occurred in any kind of sense of an objective reality, what we do is instead use those details of events to understand the subject, the narrator, the speaker as they exist now. What do their perception of those past events tell us about them now? What does the narrator's perception of the context in which they are speaking, how does that perception affect the narrative, the packaging of the narrative? So it moves us from understanding this past of the narrator to the very, very present of the narrator. What is the narrator trying to accomplish as an agent? What identities is the narrator inventing for themselves as they speak or write? How is the context affecting the narrator or shaping the narration? How is the narrative, in a way, acting back on the context, on the audience, etc.? So, again, I think we'll see this jumping out, and I have seen it jumping out of Georgakopoulou's work. This sort of, let's not worry about thinking about what actually happened, but rather how the narration tells me something about what's happening now, how this relation of past events reflects on the speaker in the moment. So something kind of interesting when we start to talk about Dr. Georgakopoulou is that there isn't much honestly, there isn't much out there, at least Googleable. And there's definitely no Wikipedia page. We might be able to work on that for her. But when we find her on her university's website, we get some details, including an email, which will come up as important a little later on. But we do find that she's a professor of discourse analysis and sociolinguistics at King's College London. Started there in 1993, and she's teaching in some interesting areas of language, linguistics, culture, and specifically language politics. And you can see them here on the slide: stories, discourse, identity, culture, social media. These things will all come up as I give you some snapshots of her work. There's a bio that comes along with the handbook that she co-edited fairly recently, which describes her as having published 11 books and about 70 articles, so she's been quite productive. These publications discussing storytelling, identities, small stories, and issues of self-representation or presentation in social media. So she does have something of an online presence as a scholar. And so a quick view of these. So here on academia.edu, you see that she has 34 papers. Whether you can read them or not, I'm not quite sure. But you can see people have been pretty interested in her work. At this point, she is top 4% of scholars. I don't know if that's in the subject area or in general, but there's some potential influence there. On ResearchGate, she has 46 publications, and again, it's quite a bit of interaction, 970 citations. I'm not sure how that works, or if that's, I'm not sure what counts as a citation, in other words. But again, quite a bit of influence and interaction. But most interesting, I think, here is on the Microsoft Research site. So only 20 publications are tracked here. But I like this graph because what's interesting is around 2005 you start to see this sort of sharp incline in the number of citations per year. Is it sharp? Maybe. But unfortunately it stops tracking at 2012. But we'll see there that date, that year, 2005, come up again a little later. And we might get a sense of why we see this increase. So here I'll get into, again, some snapshots of her work. And early on, she shows that she's interested in narrative, so which is why she came up in our class. And language, particularly Greek. In fact, she's published in Greek, which I think is quite interesting. Identity, and young people a little bit later on. But yeah, I'm sort of seeing these threads. Of course, we had narrative, as I said, identity, that continues on for quite a while. And then even fairly recently, 2009, she edited a book that was put out on political issues concerning the Greek language. Some influences that are apparent: sociolinguistics. I mean, she associates herself with that paradigm strongly, sociocultural theory, and then certainly some critical theory and post-structuralism. What's also interesting is she had serious doubts about Lebov's, in particular, but Lebov's ideas of narrative and like this stable sort of real, again, actually happeningness of his view on narrative, this historical view that the speaker is somehow reliable, and that what matters is this sort of sense of history and structured history. She already had some doubts, and those doubts really came to fruition. Is that a thing? Her doubts were really voiced when she came up with this construct of small stories, under or with influence from, I know she cited Oakes and Capps, some of their ideas, and Bomberg, is it? Anyway, so there was a real turning point. So her first publication, as she points to it, as coming to this idea of small stories in 2005. Remember that year, from her incline or her increase of citations per year. And her first full text on the subject came out in 2007. And just recently, fairly recently, she co-edited a handbook on narrative research, and she wrote a chapter basically legitimizing small stories in that text. So what's interesting is small stories stand in real contrast to big stories. The sort of Lebavian narrative of this, the lifeline, this sequential event by event organized with the beginning and end. And so these small stories, in contrast, have, they're very fragmented, unfinished. I could be reading off of the slide here, unfolding in real time. They're performative. They are in natural context. Sometimes they project the future, which is certainly not something Lebov would have counted. And they're jointly constructed, or often jointly constructed. So we have these small stories that she was getting really excited about. And what's interesting is she again is, as I mentioned earlier in that short reflection, she is focusing on the here and now in construction and invention of identity and this reflexivity of context in relation to the narrative itself. She's focusing on these things in small stories, but really small stories, I believe, they really blossom and take up this sense of immediacy in social media. And naturally, it seems that's where she's focusing now, because social media is all about the moment. What's happening here, what's happening now. So it's very immediate, hyper-contextualized. Counter-narrative, this is still something I'm trying to get my head around, but that phrase seems to come up semi-regularly. And then, let's say, like think of a meme, where you can take a meme, give it a new meaning, and send it off, and somebody will take that and send it off. And so we have these meanings that are just attached and thrown on stuff and moved around, shareable, all that stuff, so recontextualizable. And we can see that her first social media publication came out in 2013. So again, it's fresh. She's really working on some cutting edge stuff. But I wanted to share with you, like I said when I mentioned the email, that she really very kindly emailed me back after I invited her to share some comments on her current work and sort of where she's come, some advice for researchers, young researchers like us. So she did give me just a great email with some really cool insight into her work and sort of how she's approaching things these days. Well, as I've mentioned, she's really looking into social media from a small story paradigm. It's interesting because initially she kind of intended to really critique Lebov's thinking on narrative, and she says canonical paradigms, that sort of biographical sense of narrative. But instead, she's become more open, and it says, you can read it there a little later, seeing small stories as a bridge. What I think is really cool is she's trying to take this open-minded approach to seeing how other scholars treat and think about small stories, with a more the merrier kind of approach. But really where she sees herself going is taking up critical and ideological issues and checking the implications of identifying and working with small stories, thinking of them in terms of ethical research on social media, which is great. I mean, it sounds just really positive. It's really, like, as I mentioned, cutting edge. She's doing just doing really cool stuff. And what I'm excited about is that it's possible that I'll be trying out this construct of small stories myself as I begin my own research, as I'm hitting this component phase of the Sizzle program here at UB. So I'm excited just to get to know her work more. I really recommend it. I mean, it kind of helps me sort of understand the products of the narrative turn a little bit better, sort of the underlying philosophies of it. And so this is really taking that narrative turn almost not necessarily to the extreme, but to its logical end, focusing not on that sort of long, telescopic view of the past, but on the here and now, the immediate. What does the narrative in this moment tell us about context, and how's the context acting on the narrative, how is it acting back on the context. So some really great stuff that I really recommend